Greetings, conservatives. This is your humble host, John Moraga, and we are back with more ConservaCast. We look forward to keeping you informed with the latest and most relevant commentary of conservative issues. So without further ado, here are a few topics I'd like to discuss.
Let's talk immigration. Now, I think I have a little bit more authority to speak on this issue than some other conservative commentators. Now, I say that only because of my DNA, my genetics. That's not to say that other conservative commentators can't speak to this issue, but there may be a handful of other Hispanic or Mexican conservative commentators out there. And I put those in quotes because I want to explain and elaborate a little bit more. I'm going to come back to the actual specific issue of immigration. The reason why I think I have a little bit more authority than other conservative commentators is that I've experienced firsthand some type of discrimination or prejudice for being a person of Mexican descent, Mexican heritage. Somebody who is otherwise classified as Hispanic American. Now, it's a bit tricky because I am what would be considered third, fourth generation, depending on how you classify that, American. I served in the military. My father served in the military. He was drafted, went to Vietnam. I enlisted. But we were born here, but our forefathers or ancestors did live in Mexico. And some of them lived in what would be considered pre-United States Mexico, Arizona, California. And so there is a bit of a crossover of culture, so to speak, between being American and being Mexican. Now, although we were born here and our ancestors were here legally, we still get lumped into the bigger community. We still are considered part of the Hispanic community. What that means, what that actually is, becomes ambiguous. So growing up, there were some assumptions that, for example, when I was in grade school, early grade school, there was an assumption that I should be in a ESL class or English Second Language courses. My father had to go to the principal and fight and argue for me to be in English-only classes because the administration of the school assumed that I should be with a class who had either bilingual parents or Spanish-only speaking parents. And so even at a very early age, there was a bit of this identity confusion. Well, if I'm American and I don't even know Spanish, my parents may know it, but they primarily speak English. That's what they were brought up in. That's what they know. That's their first language. Why am I being grouped into this other subcategory? So there are other examples that I could provide, especially growing up in a California, in a Los Angeles, in a suburb of Los Angeles. It speaks to that firsthand knowledge of what it's considered by the state or by politicians or those in education want to basically engineer and progress their own agenda without my choice. Now, as I've said before, I grew up in a relatively affluent suburb of Los Angeles, California, where my family really was one of a handful of other Hispanic families. In fact, for a long time, I think we really were the only Mexican family in our neighborhood. And so the predominantly white population of our neighborhood was heavily influential. I didn't feel a lot of discrimination per se, as much as there was the assumption that we assimilated. There were phrases, there were ways of speaking that just kind of came naturally. Well, when I started to go to school in junior high and high school especially, we moved after elementary school. There was again this revisitation of my classmates, even trying to draw me into this Chicano identity. And the administrators, the teachers were very sympathetic and very encouraging of this type of cultural diversity and lumping me in with them. And it was very confusing because although I knew what my heritage was and what my culture was, I didn't really identify with this larger social engineering activism that was going on around me. But it was very, very prominent, especially in California. Now, obviously, people of Mexican descent and Black people have different histories, different cultures. But one common thing that we have is when we don't identify with the larger community as our primary identity, and especially if we're conservatives, or identify more with American patriotism and conservatism, we get shunned. We get put in a bubble, not only amongst white America, so-called white America, but even more so among other people who would otherwise identify as Mexican or Black. Perfect example. Some of you may be very familiar with a conservative commentator named Larry Elder. Great conservative commentator. I don't agree with everything of his, but he is still a conservative commentator who has talked in length about this same thing as a Black person. He identifies with his Black culture, whether it's sayings or just cultures or experiences that he's had. His DNA, his genetics, is that he is a Black man in America. But he's called an Uncle Tom. He's called all kinds of things by other Black people who think he's sold out. And that's something very common within the quote unquote Hispanic community. Now, I'm old enough, barely old enough, to remember that even white people would identify as Irish, Italian, German, English, Jewish. White people would claim a type of background or heritage without hyphenating it, without having to say, I'm an Italian American, I'm a Irish American. In the same way, growing up, I identified as Mexican, not because I was a Mexican nationalist or because I was a Mexican citizen. That was my heritage, that was my culture. Outside of that, I was 100% American, and there was no need to hyphenate the American. I still ate tacos and burritos, and my mom still spoke Spanglish to me, words in Spanish and English. My grandmother, who was very knowledgeable of Spanish, but English was still her first language, would still speak to me a few words in Spanish, sayings, slangs. I mean, there was still a culture that was appreciated and celebrated. But it wasn't to the point that it overtook our American identity. We were Americans first and foremost, much like any white Irish American or white Italian American or German American. I remember my first girlfriend in high school. I won't say her name, but it was a German last name. But her father was actually Italian American, hyphenated for the sake of this conversation. Because her mother and father were divorced, she took on her mother's last name, her mother's maiden name, and her mother was German American. But there was no sense to there was no identifying her as she belongs in Italy. She comes from Italy. She belongs in Germany. She comes from Germany. There was just a blanket understanding that there was a heritage and a culture identified within us that didn't identify who we were in the broader sense as Americans. So all that to say, in this particular situation with immigration as an issue that's come up, especially with President Trump and his talk about building a wall and reducing the flow of immigrants and withdrawing the DACA program. As I said, we get kind of called out as being sellouts if we don't agree and toe the line of the radical immigration activists. If we don't support illegal immigration or those crossing the border illegally just to find a better life, we get called sellouts. Oh, well, you wouldn't really be here if it wasn't for your, ancestors doing that. And actually, because of my own family history, I would be. Either we were, when I say we, my ancestors were either came here legally or they were here before it was actually the United States. What I mean by that is that a lot of my ancestors were either in the state of Arizona, California, before they actually became part of the Union. So when they became part of the Union, they were automatically became citizens or were citizens because that was part of the process. So there wasn't any crossing of a border or illegal crossing, at least in my family background. And that's true of a lot of other Hispanic Americans or those who would identify as Mexican. So it's hard to relate to the specific claims of trying to cross the border to find a better life or to have a better situation given. That being said, as somebody who also understands Scripture, who is a very Bible-believing person who believes in grace and believes in forgiveness and believes in compassion, I don't doubt there is a strong desire to want to have a better life, to try and come to the promised land, so to speak. I don't deny that there is that zeal among a lot of people. And it is hard. It is hard when you see stories, you hear stories. There are people that you would know or encounter who have been here, whether they're workers or just people in the neighborhood. A lot of them are decent people. But as somebody who obeys the law, as somebody who served in the military, especially as a security forces member who has a background in legal issues, there is still a need to preserve the laws of the land that are in place. If the laws are changed, that's something different. But because there are laws here, if we just throw them out and don't have any type of adherence to them, there becomes chaos. And above that, beyond that, there is the reality that we can't really filter through who does come in. There are a lot of shady people who have entered in through a very weak border, who have perpetuated a lot of organized crime, who have been able to abuse the system in a lot of ways, economically, legally. However smaller of a percentage, however few that number may be, they still exist. It's still a reality. And so when I or others speak out against this, and trying to maintain more of a law and order system, we get called sellouts because we should be part of this activism simply because of our genetics, because of our skin color, our DNA, simply because our ancestors were perhaps similar to the current flow of people coming in. And what I mean similar, just genetically, culturally, heritage-wise, that we should agree with them. And one of the things that people don't realize is that there is a large percentage of Hispanic Americans those who would identify as Mexican in culture and heritage, who are very anti-illegal immigration, who do support President Trump's at least theoretical push to try and reduce the flow of illegal immigration. There is a growing number of Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans, who are also supporting President Trump. And if I'm not mistaken, he did get quite a big percentage of Hispanics in the last election in 2016. And I only use those terms because that's what a lot of people use, even conservatives, to identify identity politics people in categories. But if even using those metrics, he already had an impressive percentage of Hispanics supporting him in the last election. I think there's even a growing number of Hispanics that the media doesn't want to talk about, the activists don't like to acknowledge. They're growing because they make the assumption that Hispanics will be anti-Trump and that being anti-illegal immigration automatically causes Hispanics to be anti-Trump. And the same thing with a lot of Black people. People take their vote for granted and assume that just because there are a number of things that they try and pin on Trump to be racist, that they're going to not vote for him, or that he's going to lose their support. I think he has a growing support amongst Hispanics, amongst Black people. And it's going to be a surprising outcome, I think, in 2020, even more so than in 2016. But as far as this specific issue of illegal immigration, it is something that is amongst a Hispanic community, those of Mexican heritage, understand and can make a distinction between illegal immigration and illegal immigrants and those who are here legally, who have family who have been here legally for generations, and we're not lumped in to a huge voting bloc that the liberals would like to have. Where there is a nuance to this demographic, this group of people that the liberals just tend to ignore and try and still, even if they do know that it's out there and exists, they try and put a blind side to it and convince you or convince the public that it's a unified block of voting. It's an echo chamber within a demographic or group of people that just isn't so. And so I don't want to take away from any other conservative commentator speaking on this issue. It's just growing up, having experiences, and being assumed to identify one way, and being assumed to believe certain things just because of my DNA and heritage and genetics. I think there's a little bit more firsthand knowledge on this, and not to take away from anybody else, but it's just something that I think should be put out there more, should be spoken out against more. Other Hispanic conservative commentators, I know I'm not the only one, but I think it should be put in the forefront a lot more than it is. I don't hear too much of it, and so whether you hear it or you try and put it out there, by all means, please, this needs to be talked about a lot more. There needs to be more people out there to go on TV, go on public venues to make this distinction and say that there is support for strong border security, for law and order. And as I said, if the laws change, that's something different. I personally am not for necessarily changing all the laws. There's always room for improvement, always ways to do things and try and make things a little bit smoother. But for the most part, I believe we need to have a strong border. We need to stop the flow of a lot of anti-immigration, a lot of, I don't like using the term anchor babies, mainly because, to no fault of their own, it's hard when children are used as a scapegoat, as a tool for their parents' illegal activities. But yes, it is something that needs to be revisited, how easily it is for there to be a process once there is a child born in this country. At the same time, we do need to enforce those laws. We do need to have a stronger border security. There are too many reasons to not strengthen the border, and there's too many reasons to stop that flow. So, although I don't agree with everything of President Trump, as I've said numerous times, this is one area that I think, as a Hispanic American, as somebody of Mexican heritage, there are a number of us out there, albeit not public voices. There are many, many others who believe the same thing. Unfortunately, we're called sellouts. Unfortunately, we get lumped into this equivalent of an Uncle Tom of Black people. As I said, Larry Elder is a perfect example of that. So I would like to encourage that conversation to get a little bit more attention. I think it will come the actual election of 2020 as it gets closer. But just look out for that, and hopefully you can be a part of making that happen as well.
Thanks for joining us once again, and we hope you will invite your friends and family to join us in our efforts to champion conservatism for generations to come.